morning, everyone. Welcome to the penultimate literature session. Man's inner nature, self-reflection and being psychological. I'm your chair, Craig Fairnington from the Institute of Ideas. So we started off, went to the Garden of Eden with Milton. We stopped to admire the scenery with Wordsworth. But it's now time to turn inwards. In the words of that famous poet, Charlene, I've been to paradise, but I've never been to me. So our lecturer today is Tim Black, and he's told me that that's all the introduction I am to give him. So if you want to find out more, check out your biography in your packs. So Tim, over to you.
Hello, you can all hear me quite clearly, yeah? There's no music, it's a bit, no? Okay. Now, I think it's almost a cliche to say that literary modernism, I'm thinking here of Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, or Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities, or indeed Virginia Woolf's The Lighthouse. I think it's almost a cliche to say that literary modernism is marked, defined even by a turn inwards, a focus on man's inner nature. That's not a slight on the title.
You're not very loud.
I'm not very loud. Okay, I'll try to be louder. I think it's almost a cliche to say that literary modernism is marked, defined even by a turn inwards, a focus on man's inner nature, on the workings of consciousness, on the prison house of subjectivity. But I do think there's truth to this cliche, that the explosion of formally challenging anti-realist works which began to emerge in the second half of the 19th century, reaching their high point in the interwar years, I think there's truth to the idea that this constellation of literature was marked, and I know it's crude, by a turn inwards, by a massive subjectivism. However, I think a better understanding of the range of works which constitute literary modernism, why and when they emerged and so on, can be gained by seeing modernism not so much as a turn inwards, but also as a turn away from. And that turn, as I've hinted formerly, was away from the conventions and traditions of realist fiction, plot, moments of decision, dramatic dialogue and character development through plot and so on. But more importantly, it was a turn away from the ground on which the great 19th century realist fictions flourished, and that ground was social and historical reality, a thoroughly humanised reality in which men were making history. And I think that's important to remember. Because while classical realist writers like Stendhal or Balzac, for instance, were certainly far from being fans of how things were, they were critical realists. Their novels and the conventions of their novels assumed that meaning and truth was to be sought in representing the world out there, in representing men making history. Not in the conditions of their choosing perhaps, but nevertheless, men making history out there in the world. Remember, it was Stendhal who deployed that classic metaphor for realist fiction, the mirror. A novel is a mirror carried along a high road, he writes to Scarlett and Black. At one moment it reflects to your vision the azure skies, at another the mire of the puddles at your feet. And the man who carries this mirror in his pack will be accused of you of being immoral. His mirror shows the mire and you blame the mirror. Rather blame that high road upon which the puddle lies, still more the inspector of roads who allows the water to gather and the puddle to form. But something happens to this sort of critical, this realist vocation, this mimetic novelistic tradition, this desire to hold up a mirror to reality and objectively reflect the struggles and aspirations of and between people in a specific situation. That is, to misquote Virginia Woolf, on or about June 1848, human character changed. Or to be less flippant about it, the crushing of the revolutionary upsurge which haunted Europe, as the Communist Manifesto had it, during 1848, the crushing of this movement brought to a head something like an ideological crisis, a spiritual crisis among a largely sort of bourgeois literary avant-garde. The essential optimism of the pre-1848 era, with dreams of self-governance, equality and liberty still resonant, the heroic age, if you like, of bourgeois thought and deed, of the French Revolution, of German idealism, all this had all but disappeared by the 1850s. Ideas of progress, of a movement towards a better society, a sense that social life could be transformed for the better, such aspirations appear to have withered. To writers and poets, especially those in France, confronted by the farcical nature of looming Napoleon Bonaparte on the throne, social and historical reality no longer appeared vital. It appeared petrified. It appeared almost absurd. And it's at this point, I think, that you get the stirrings of what we will come to know as modernism. Because it's at this point at which aesthetic modernity separates off from and even turns on social and political modernity. That is, the elements of modernity, you think self-determination, autonomy, start to constitute an aesthetic realm not just apart from modernity manifested in the social world, but in opposition to it. The aesthetic becomes the real domain of self-creation, not social life. Make of yourself a work of art, commands Nietzsche in the 1870s. Also, it's at this moment, of course, that the figure many associate with trailblazing modernism, the poet Charles Baudelaire, the creator of Les Fleurs de Mal, 1857, and the author of a key modernist text, The Painter of Modern Life, 1863. Hence he emerges at this point. Baudelaire's take on post-1848 society is revealing. He describes it as wholly worn out, worse than worn out, brutalised and greedy, wholly repelled by fiction, adoring only material possessions. There you have it, I think. On the one side, society, brutalised and greedy, materialistic. On the other side, art, or fiction, as Baudelaire has it. And this is a key moment. To repeat myself, a crucial cleavage is emerging, one that is essential to the development of modernism. Art, the aesthetic as an ideal, presented here as fiction, is seen in opposition to brutal, greedy, dispiriting society. In England, you can see such sentiments appear in the work of, say, someone like Walter Pater, and later the so-called sort of decadent poets, a chief associate of whom was, as you all know, Oscar Wilde, who famously declared that all art is useless, but I think to be read as a riposte, if you like, to the crude instrumentalism of social life. And you see this again in the novels of Flaubert. Yes, his work is characterised by what looks like an attention to realistic detail. Flaubert, after all, is famed for his precision, his dedication to a naturalistic portrayal of reality. But the result is not realism as it emerged in the work of his pre-1848 antecedents. Their fictional worlds were full of life, their characters were full of potential, of becoming. Rather, Flaubert's work presents us with a deadening, dispirited, futureless world of imbecile, petty bourgeois convention. Every aspect of the world of Madame Bovary, for instance, is cast in the light of Flaubert's disdain. Even the semi-tragic figure of Emma herself, whose misfortune it was to have believed in the romantic ideals of sort of penny dreadful poetry, is trapped in this static, issueless world. Flaubert simply doesn't identify with this reality, with the mores, aspirations, and social conventions he describes. He's estranged from it. In his own words, I've always tried to live in an ivory tower, but this tide of shit is beating at its walls to undermine it. And what is this ivory tower? It's an incredibly fetishised notion of art. The point I'm labouring to make here is that the modernist moment was born from a profound crisis of meaning, an estrangement of the writer, of literature, from the trajectory of social and political reality, and the mimetic traditions that went with representing that reality. Hence, the modernist moment is sometimes talked about as a crisis of representation, of what it was that was to be represented. The turbulent interaction of men no longer appeared meaningful. It appeared crude, dominated at best by commercial rationale that didn't really appear to be all that rational. And this is why I think the modernist works of literature are characterised by their attention to form and that perpetual drive to innovate formally, to find new ways to capture and convey meaning, truth, the essence of it all. And that's because the modern writer was having to create and forge the meaning that reality, as far as they were concerned, no longer yielded. Their only resource was subjectivity, the self. We saw yesterday the Romantics struggled with this too, but they still had recourse to nature, to a rural agricultural way of life. At the end of Swan's Way, the first volume of Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, published in 1913, the narrator Marcel is surveying the present. He sees the motor cars, he sees the latest fashions, the great ornamental boons, if you like, of modernity, and it means nothing to him. Proust writes, "This scene seemed to proclaim the inhuman emptiness of this deconsecrated forest, and help me to understand how paradoxical it is to seek in reality for the pictures that are stored in one's memory." And this, of course, is what Proust did. He didn't seek truth in reality, in things out there, in the world out there. He sought truth in the subjective experience of things. And even that's not quite right. He sought truth in the recollection of the subjective experience of things. He turned his voluntary memory, as the philosopher Henri Bergson had it, upon his involuntary memory. And from that storehouse of subjective experience, he managed to weave meaning, to weave the essence of his life into an immeasurably rich tapestry of reminiscence into his art. And it's here, finally, with Proust, that we come at last to Virginia Woolf and to the Lighthouse. Now, Woolf's admiration for Proust is well established. In the Times Literary Supplement in 1922, she wrote a piece about Henry James. And towards the end of the piece, she states, "The years have mounted up since James's last novels. We may expect the novel to change and develop as it is explored by the most vigorous minds of a very complex age. What have we not, indeed, to expect from Monsieur Proust alone? As it turned out, not very much, because Proust died a few weeks later." In 1927, in a letter to Woolf's sister Vanessa Bell, Woolf is unequivocal in her praise for Proust. Proust is by far the greatest modern novelist. And I think Woolf recognised in Proust her own aspirations, I think. His work confirmed the rectitude of what she aspired towards, a type of fiction, a type of novel that wasn't grounded in the representation of exterior happenings. There wasn't a plot-driven, descriptive narrative that didn't concern itself with the social significance of buttons and a raincoat. Rather, for Woolf, as it was for Proust, the important thing, the essential thing, was an individual's consciousness in the act of making meaning from experience. That was where the truth lay, that was where the essence of things happened. Not in the description of the clothes someone wears or the house they live in. No, the essential thing is the infinite universe of the interior, the place where the meaning and significance of things and people is generated, where one forms impressions of things. That is to the materialism, the staid conventional realism of contemporary writers like John Galsworthy and especially poor old Arnold Bennett, who she never fails to have a bad word for. She wants to write from the inside out. This isn't simply a question of taste. Woolf doesn't simply dislike the way the materialists, as she calls Galsworthy, H.G. Wells and Bennett. She doesn't simply dislike the way they write. There's something wrong with it too. Materialism or realism, as she sees it, is inadequate to the demands and the situation of the modern writer. That's how she frames the problems in the essay Modern Fiction. So why is materialism or realism felt to be inadequate? Now, going back, if the crushing of the 1848 revolutions and in France the coup and restoration to the throne of a gross mediocrity like Louis Napoleon Bonaparte turned many French writers not only against reality but the literary form it had underpinned, realism, then there's an equally symbolic breaking point for Woolf and certain of her Anglophone contemporaries, namely the First World War. After this event, to seek meaning and truth in the external world, one that to Woolf appeared to have sunk into barbarism, was nonsensical. So, into the Lighthouse, during the time passes section, that's the kind of the middle section, which is effectively a portrait of objective time, a narrative of things happening, noticeably apart from any sort of human subjectivity. The human world appears during this section only in parentheses. In this section, Woolf plays upon the inclination to see meaning, purpose and value in the external world, the pathetic fallacy. She even references the realist metaphor of choice, the mirror. In these mirrors, she writes, the minds of men in these pools of uneasy water in which clouds forever turn and shadows form, dreams perish, and it was impossible to resist the strange intonation which every gull, flower, tree, man and woman, and the whole earth itself seem to declare. The good triumphs, happiness prevails, order rules. But this illusion of truth, of meaning being embodied in the external world, is ruined. Barbarism, unreason intrudes upon the scene. A shell explodes, she writes, and later a fighter plane's entrails appear, an ashen-coloured strip, a purple stain upon the surface of the sky. You see, to see in the world out there, to see in natural history something meaningful and purposeful unfolding, something on which to ground art, to ground Woolf's art, on which to ground a novel, in which to see order or good, was no longer an option for Woolf. She writes, to pace the beach was impossible, contemplation unendurable, and this is key, the mirror was broken. So what happens into the Lighthouse? How does Woolf write without recourse to the mirror? The mirror is still there, of course. There is, to all intents and purposes, a plotted story into the lighthouse. Characters doing things in an objective situation, in this case a holiday cottage on the Isle of Skye. And it's an incredible story, it's a real thrill ride. A little boy, James, wants to go to the lighthouse. His mum, Mrs. Ramsay, wants him to go to the lighthouse, but his dad, Mr. Ramsay, says they can't go to the lighthouse. They don't go to the lighthouse. Mrs. Ramsay dies, years pass. They go back to the holiday cottage. James wants to go to the lighthouse. Mr. Ramsay says they can go to the lighthouse. They go to the lighthouse, the end. But of course, that's not really what is important, except symbolic. Woolf doesn't concern himself with external events. They're entirely subordinate to the subjective interior space where time can expand to an eternity. The exterior is entirely subordinate to the interior. What a character is doing, sewing up a brown stocking, reading a book, even attempting to paint, as Lily Bristow seems to be doing throughout. These are little more than hooks on which Woolf hangs these lyrical swoops into what she believes is really important, this streaming and eddying of multiple human consciousnesses. That is Woolf's subject, it seems, this subterranean psychic life out of which individual characters rise up before sinking back down again. Little wonder that the waves is Woolf's metaphor of choice. It captures this non-visible, this dark psychological reality, its movement and its rhythms. And the result of Woolf's focus on this dark interior life is not only an incredible triumph of literary form, forging significance from the linguistic stuff of consciousness. It's mesmerising, a mesmerising kaleidoscopic whirl of multiple interiorities, from William Banks to Lily Bristow, from Charles Stanley to Mrs. Ramsay herself, each offering us their own window onto the other characters. There's no objective truth here, of course, only bounded perspectives, like a cubist painting revealing the appearance of an object only at multiple angles. In a single paragraph, the locus of Woolf's stream of consciousness will switch. It might be Lily Briscoe admiring Mr. Ramsay's intellectual strength, then suddenly it might be his son James resenting his father's needy tyranny. But there is of course more to it than that. Woolf is not exploring this subterranean psychic life for its own sake, any more than Proust was. She's not a neuroscientist or a psychologist. She's not actually trying to understand how the mind works. Rather, what you have into the lighthouse is the attempt to create art, the attempt to create something meaningful without recourse to an external referent, nature or objective truth. It's an attempt to wrest meaning from within subjectivity itself, which as I've tried to suggest, characterises the modernist moment. And this drama, this crisis of meaning, this struggle for meaning, is actually played out into the lighthouse. And it works like this. Mrs. Ramsay is the dominant consciousness of the first section. In relation to her and through her, all others seem to find their place. She's the repository feeling of sentiment, as opposed to the rather sort of harsh, prosaic reason of a philosopher, rather of a philosopher husband, a kind of macho archetype, Mr. Ramsay. Seen in the consciousness of others, she is an enchanting force, in the strong sense of giving meaning. Hence we learn constantly of her beauty. At one point we are told, we hear of Mrs. Ramsay, that the whole effort of merging and flowing and creating rested on her. But in one of the most perfunctory deaths in literary history, Mrs. Ramsay is suddenly taken out of the novel. The creative force, the figure in whom the others find meaning and succour, is now absent. The absence, that lack of meaning, is the prompt in the final section, the lighthouse, for an attempt to forge meaning in the absence of she who provided it. So firstly, Mr. Ramsay and his two resentful children do actually commence and complete the journey to the lighthouse. And secondly, artist Lily Briscoe, the kind of wolf archetype in the novel, attempts to finish her painting, to express something in the absence, to quote Samuel Beckett, anything to express, in the absence of the creative authority, which was Mrs. Ramsay. At one point, Lily confronts the canvas in the final section and reflects, what did it mean? Could things thrust their hands up and grip one? Could the blade cut, the first grasp? Was there no safety, no learning by heart of the ways of the world, no guide, no shelter, but all was miracle and leaping from the pinnacle of a tower into the air? Lily wants the world to have meaning. She wants the world before the mirror was broken, before Mrs. Ramsay died, before the First World War broke out. And in the absence of a muse, of something external to herself, Woolf writes, if Lily shouted loud enough, Mrs. Ramsay would return. Mrs. Ramsay, she said aloud. Mrs. Ramsay. The tears ran down her face. But there's a reckoning. So just as Mr. Ramsay and his grown-up children are pushing on to the lighthouse, so Lily pushes on with her painting. She recognises that what she needs to do, which is what Woolf has already done, is to get hold of that luminescent halo of life, as Woolf describes it in modern fiction, our subjective experience of things, our consciousness. Woolf writes that what Lily wished to get hold of was that very jar on the nerves, the thing itself before it had been made anything. Get that and start afresh, get that and start afresh, she said desperately, pitching herself firmly again before the easel. It was a miserable machine, an inefficient machine, she thought, the human apparatus for painting or for feeling. It always broke down at a critical moment. Heroically, one must force it on. Again, the Samuel sort of Beckett-like sentiment is striking. And so the novel ends with the painting finished and the trip to the lighthouse completed. And this is the key. Well, is it the key? I'm not sure. This is the key. The novel has completed itself. Lily has finished her picture, and in doing so has explained and justified Woolf's approach to the novel. Woolf has given us what she promised in modern fiction, an expression of the varying, the unknown, and uncircumscribed spirit, whatever the aberration or complexity it may display, with as little mixture of the alien and external as possible. Now, I think there is a bleakness in Woolf too, a sense of failure, but I'm just going to leave that hanging there. I'm going to switch focus now and look at an almost exact contemporary of Virginia Woolf. I'm talking, of course, of Franz Kafka, who was born in 1883, a year after Woolf. Now, Kafka was quite a significant figure, I think it's fair to say. According to one of the many recent biographies of Kafka, after Shakespeare, no other author generates more PhDs, monographs, critical studies, and coffee table books than Franz Kafka. His name is also an all-purpose adjective, Kafkaesque. It's used for any situation in which someone feels frustrated with the actions of some organisation or other. It doesn't have to be some old Eastern Bloc state bureaucracy. It could be Marks and Spencer Customer Service Department, or the leaky Edward Snowden stuck in a Moscow airport. They're all too easily labelled Kafkaesque situations. And it's a bit of a problem. Kafka is a phenomenon, a writer who could seem impossible to read because it feels like he's already been read for us, that we already know what he's saying before he said it. But I think it's necessary to attempt to do that, to read him afresh. Now, I think the first thing that's noticeable, certainly in the context of modernism and the inward turn, or being psychological, as the lecture title has it, is how ostensibly realistic Kafka's work is. There's little in the way of interiority as regards Kafka's characters, and certainly nothing like a stream of consciousness. In fact, many of the techniques and tropes associated with modernist works are entirely absent in Kafka. Instead, you get incredibly detailed descriptions of offices, musty courtrooms, cramped attic spaces, cathedrals, and his attention to the physical details of characters is pronounced too, be it the men with the beards like claws, or hunchbacked officials, or these kind of angel whores which seduce Kay at various points. But as Albert Camus argues in the myth of Sisyphus, the realism is illusory, it's unreal. In fact, he writes, it's a spiritual tragedy, this is how Camus puts it, expressed onto the concrete. Kafka's Prague, that old clawing crone was forced him to yield to a place he barely left around his life, is thoroughly allegorised. Its concrete elements are transfigured by Kafka's imagination. They're turned into the signifiers of his own vision. Psychological reality here becomes reality. This is surrealism, if you like, before surrealism, and it's probably a lot better too. His vision of the unanswered quest for truth and meaning is literally realised in the forms of attics, village castles, judiciary, halls, office lumber rooms, and beetles. So despite appearances, Kafka's very own literary universe, the tremendous world I have inside my head, as he put it, is arguably one of the most intensely subjectivised of all the modernist enterprises. Kafka's particular vision of a crisis of meaning, of the withdrawal of truth from the world that acts as if it's still present, is transformed or transmogrified into art. But before I get ahead of myself, let's quickly look at the Metamorphosis, if that's possible. Now, this was one of the few works of Kafka's that was actually published during his lifetime. It's the story of Gregor Samsa, who after some uneasy dreams wakes up as a big old bug. The first thing that's striking is the black comedy of the situation. Gregor's woken up as a giant beetle, and his first concern, is it horror? Is it what the... No. That's the thing about Kafka's world. Nothing is astonishing. So Gregor's first concern upon discovering he's transformed into a beetle, it's being late for work. The incredible, the frightening is perfectly normal in Kafka. But obviously it's not just comedic, although there is a lot of laughter in the dark with Kafka. It's also incredibly melancholy. Gregor is still, as far as he's concerned, human. He still uses language. He still thinks as a human. It's just he's a beetle. But his family, especially his father, who he still lives with, cannot see this humanity. They can only see the big dung beetle. And they can't communicate with him, nor he with them. And this is what's ingenious. Kafka's almost turned an age-old emotional estrangement between father and son into a physical estrangement. He's given it concrete form. He's given concrete form to an anxiety, a state of mind. Recall the first line. Gregor Samsa awoke from some uneasy dreams one morning to find himself transformed into a giant bird. Some uneasy dreams. One of the most interesting things that emerges here, and it's a prominent theme throughout Kafka's universe, I think, is forgetting. A forgetting of Gregor's humanity in particular, and a forgetting of the past in general. Hence, Gregor's struggle in the Metamorphosis is a struggle to remember who he is. So when his sister and mother are talking about clearing the room, Kafka writes, he would admittedly be able to crawl all over the place unimpeded, but at the price of rapidly and completely forgetting his human past. Why? He was on the verge of forgetting already, and he'd only been rallied by hearing his mother's voice again after all this time. Nothing was to be removed, it must all stay. The positive influence that the furniture had on his condition was something he could not do without. Much of the furniture prevented him from indulging in stupid crawling, and that was no disadvantage, but a very good thing. It enabled him, if you like, to remember, to retain his humanity, his sense of himself. But his sister insists, and the furniture goes, and eventually Gregor himself forgets himself, acquiesces, and dies like a beetle. And the response of Gregor's father, he says to his wife and daughter, forget the past, can't we? This idea that we've forgotten something, that we've lost something, brings us to Kafka's novels. Now, unlike the Metamorphosis, neither the Castle nor the Trial were published during Kafka's lifetime. The part that was the first section of America, the Stoker. Now, there's a good reason why the Trial and Castle weren't published. As I'm sure you all know, they weren't finished. The Castle ends mid-sentence, and the order of the chapters in the Trial was decided by Kafka's literary executioner, Max Brod. You read it, and there's little relation between the chapters. You read the Trial of it. Each could stand alone. That could never happen with a work of realism. You couldn't just fiddle around the chapters of Old Goryeo. But in some ways that doesn't matter. Kafka's novels weren't plot-driven. Rather, they were allegories pointing towards their own transcendence. The point being access to the law or access to the castle administration that would suddenly sort of fill Kafka's world with truth, that would resolve the questions pursued. But of course that point never arrives, and it never can. They are allegories for which there is no transcendence, for which the only ground of meaning, such as the nature of modernism, is Kafka himself. He can quest after meaning, indeed he has to, but he refuses to provide it for himself. He refuses to invent it. He refuses to do, in some ways, what certain more right-wing, if that's the right word, modernism has ended up doing, which, following Nietzsche's call, they tended towards myth-making. They tended to want to sort of invent a transcendence, to collapse solitary angsty self-consciousness into some sort of grand, legitimising story. It could be the sacrifice of the self to the blood and soil as kind of racial mythology, or sacrificing the self to the forward march of technology, as in futurism, which I think someone's talking about at this very moment. So the lack of an ending, the absence of a definitive ending, not only makes little difference, nothing is going to be revealed, even if there was an ending. Kafka's novels are almost objectively unfinishable. The external authority, the truth which might complete them, is absent. In the words of the court painter to Joseph K. on whether he could be acquitted, he says, only the highest court, which is utterly inaccessible to you, me, and all of us, has that authority. Kafka K. can seek access to the law in search of an explanation for his life, indeed for his trial, or he can seek access to the council in search of a role for his life, but the access itself, the transcendence, is denied him. There is infinite hope, said Kafka to Brod, but not for us. Kafka does not indulge in myth-making, he refuses to indulge in myth-making. And this takes me back to forgetting. In Kafka's universe, especially in the trial, there is a sense that something has been forgotten, something has been lost. The left-wing critic Walter Benjamin said that Kafka presents us with the sickening of tradition. In other words, the reason for the way things are done, the age-old ground for authority, the truths which have been transmitted through the ages, are almost forgotten in Kafka's world. This is why the law, as Titcheray tells Joseph K., is in every attic. And why? Because an attic is where people put things they don't use and forget about them. And that's a key element. We no longer know the reason why. We no longer have access to the meaning of things. And here comes the terrorising part of Kafka, the bit that almost seems prophetic, which many people have interpreted as being prophetic. In the absence of knowing why, of knowing the rules by which one might live, the law, in the absence of grasping the real as rational, as Hegel put it, earthly authority acquires an arbitrary form. Forces are dictating K's life, but they appear unfathomable without rhyme or reason. In the words of the prison chaplain in the final chapter of the trial, you do not have to consider everything true, you merely have to consider it necessary. Organs of earthly authority, be they officials or fathers or judges, they're always weak initially, but suddenly capable of feats of strength. And they offer only one solution, and it's dog-like submission. An image which recurs throughout the trial and in the penal colony with the accused dog-like before the executioner. And I'm going to end now, I think. Kafka provides us with an image of the world bereft of meaning, of a world that has forgotten meaning, and I think that's important. But like Woolf does with Lily Briscoe to the Lighthouse, he also provides us with an image of permanent searching, of striving for meaning. And I think that in that duality, that struggle for meaning in a world which denies it, which we have in the modernist predicament, and I think in many ways that this partially explains the continued resonance of works which are difficult and often disconsoling. Their predicament in some ways is still our predicament. The crisis to which modernism addressed itself, reaching its high point, if you like, during the interwar years, in some ways is still our crisis. And that's me done.
Hello. Okay, thank you, Tim. Questions? We've got a microphone here. Hands, please. So, Justine, over there with Richard. Yeah, so there's another microphone here.
Tim, thanks for that. That was brilliant, very, very clear and lucid. And I was just wondering whether you could now map Thomas Mann into that as well. You know, given discussion of Beth and Venice and things. We've got Kafka or Woolf. Where does Mann sit in this modernist tendency?
Thanks. Justine, you want to hand it to Anwar if you want to go over to James.
Thank you for the lecture. It was really, really good. Wanted to ask, you say that they reflect a world that has forgotten meaning, but by forgetting, you're pointing to something that can be remembered. So that means something in the past. So why does Woolf and Kafka in this case may not be representative? Why do they not have a nostalgia towards something in the past, but they just render everything meaningless in itself? So is there like a solution of sorts? Is there a reference frame whereby they go back to? Or are they postulating that from here on now it'll just be meaningless, and that's how the way things are going to unfold?
Thank you, Jane.
Yes, again, brilliant, Tim, but your thing about saying, well, actually what happens is then a turning to art as meaning, and that does seem to be such a prevalent, we heard yesterday with Nietzsche and his belief then perhaps the mythic, the high culture becomes perhaps the mythic reason, etc. And that does just seem to be a really strong thing now, that the world has lost meaning, but art must have meaning. Art is transcendental. Art has perhaps a value and something for us that other things don't, and that still seems to hold sway. So I'd just like your thoughts upon that, I guess.
Cheers. Justin, there's a gentleman, there in the purple, do you want to hand to him? And then
Thanks. Yeah, no, I just wanted to come back to a story you mentioned briefly in the penal colony, which I think is, contains or is one of the key Kafka moments, and one of the difficulties I think that Kafka had, or that drove Kafka, but that maybe didn't drive Woolf, was the actual difficulty and perplexity of writing itself, and the You mentioned the mimetic traditions of kind of literature, how they were overturned, but it always seems to me as though Kafka experienced those much more deeply and much more intensely than anyone else, and that is embodied in the story of the penal colony. If people haven't read it, I urge people to do so. And I'd like to hear your thoughts about what having divested himself of that idea of writing as torture. Where does that leave the future for literary modernism, if any?
Brilliant, thanks. I'll come back to Tim and then we'll come out for any more questions. Are you sure? Oh, you're okay. Fine. So just right next to him.
Hi, thank you for that. I wanted to ask about a phrase you mentioned. So you talked about Woolf's presenting a dark subterranean psychology, and this has sort of come out in questions so far. Sort of, it seems obviously very pessimistic, very melancholy sort of philosophy that emerges from these writers. But I wonder, does a subterranean psychology always have to be a dark psychology, and is the only alternative something like the sort of right-wing futurist versions of modernism that you sort of alluded to? Because I mean, there are moments in To the Lighthouse, for example, of very real, beauty and poignancy in terms of, just looking at Mrs. Ramsay sort of developing opinions of her husband. So she'll look at him and she'll think, actually, she's frustrated and she wishes she would say something. But then, there's some very, very sort of beautiful, loving moments of recognition there as well. And maybe it's more palpable in Woolf than in Kafka. But I just wanted to really, sort of explore that distinction slightly more in depth, maybe.
Right, where does man fit into my schema? Man is not as radically modernist as certain of his contemporaries. It's interesting that, as I said to you the other night, the Magic Mountain at one point was sort of held up there alongside was put up there in the kind of pantheon of modernist works alongside things like Ulysses and In Search of Lost Time. But its reputation has suffered. I think it's because it's still man's work almost wants to comment on the situation of modernism. He seems to be aware of he's almost too learned. The Death in Venice, for instance, is almost man's attempt to understand art at the moment that it becomes impossible, the moment that it has to do without tradition. So what you have is, instead, you have the artist, Aschenbach, looking for meaning in something more sort of Dionysian, something more Nietzschean. He sinks into, he searches for meaning. He searches for meaning and sinks into a kind of, sexual love. And you get the impression that man's attitude towards this descent is ambiguous. He doesn't see it as positive or negative. He sees it for what it is. If art can no longer have recourse to kind of the great stories of mankind and just seeks inspiration in sort of eros, in kind of just sort of sexuality, then it's no longer the art that he particularly values. I feel that man just kind of traverses two worlds. He's well aware of some of the philosophies of modernity. He's well aware of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer and so on. And he seeks to understand and write in his fiction of the effect that would have on fiction. So he situates modernism. Lukács is very good on man, because man does deploy modernist techniques. He does deploy a stream of consciousness at certain points, but he situates it within a larger kind of objective frame. He still believes that there is access to some sort of objective truth, and I think that's how he manages to situate it. The dark. The bleakness of Kafka, as opposed to kind of the moments of beauty, the kind of sort of semi-epiphanies in Woolf. I think when Woolf talks about the dark places of psychology, I think we perhaps shouldn't think of that as something sinister. I think she means, there's little light. We've not investigated there yet. They're hidden as much as anything. It's not particularly sinister. And she wants to sort of bring those dark places out. She wants to excavate, to delve into this possible resource of artistic meaning and beauty. Into the Lighthouse, she mocks Mr. Ramsay, who has a very philosophical conception of reality. He talks about subject and object, and he's obsessed with the table and the meaning of the table. And Woolf has Mrs. Ramsay I think it's Mrs. Ramsay, it might be Lily Brisk, I forget. She has one of them mock it by suggesting that you can look at the table, but you don't see the beauty of the. You're not receptive to sort of many beautiful impressions that might go with that. So she looks in the dark places of psychology for impressions which can serve as the stuff of her art, and it does lend itself to beautiful passages, to moments of poetic symbolism. But with Woolf, there is always this kind of inescapable bleakness. There's a sense that things will end. There's always a sense that, despite the fact that she's able to excavate her interior space, to explore it and sort of dredge out these moments of beauty, everything is undercut by the objective passing of things, by the irrevocability of the passing of time, the irrevocability of the passing of history as well. That there's this world out there, it's just happening, and she's just sort of clinging on to these moments. I'm going to go back to you guys.
Any more questions? Anne-Marie, you want to go about the lady earlier on?
I was reminded a bit of Lukács's condemnation of the sort of modernists as degenerate, particularly kind of Beckett and people like that. And it's, it just occurs to me as a question, isn't there something necessary and beneficial about this kind of self-consciousness, about this turn inward and about this questioning of the kind of the past and the kind of the acceptance of the way that things have been thought about in the past and the uncomplicated nature of reality, and in Beckett in particular, the kind of all the philosophy that went with that, and it wasn't necessary, and it had to happen, and do you see something kind of positive coming out of that kind of turn inward?
Thanks. Justine, could you bring the microphone down to the lady in front of Richard?
Thanks. You can't help but sort of get a feeling of bleakness yourself. I found I was just so depressed after reading all these things. I couldn't sort of find any, the beauty was always dragged down, in fact, by the emptiness of it all. And I suppose that's the thing you kept looking for something more substantial. And I suppose in a character like Mrs. Ramsay, where there's this constant, if you like, reinforcement of the idea of her beauty, her inner tranquility in a way, as well as her frustrations, with a few of the sort of external things in her life. But I thought the bleakest thing of all was Lily's painting, in the sense that she derived sort of almost like a sort of centrifugal force through Mrs. Ramsay. They all seem to sort of derive this sort of centeredness through Mrs. Ramsay, and trying to express herself in her painting, and yet its essential privacy. She couldn't share it with anyone. She couldn't share her view of what she was seeing with anyone. In fact, she was so self-conscious about it, she couldn't actually bring it into the light of day to share her ideas or thoughts. And then I thought it was an interesting device to kill Mrs. Ramsay off pretty quickly, because then you sort of were left wondering, well, where will all these people go who've been held by this centrifugal force? And in a sense, it sort of ends, in my view, with it actually being a centripetal force, that everyone is sort of kind of blown asunder and don't have that anchor. But perhaps the question at the end of that is, it is a search for meaning, but the actual novel itself doesn't provide that sense of ever arriving at inner understanding, at an inner self-consciousness that has moved beyond these very sort of superficial views of oneself.
Yeah, Lily's painting, I don't think sounds particularly impressive. I don't think anyone's itching to see Lily's painting. But it's in the same way that Kafka points towards a transcendence which he can't reveal. I think that's what Woolf is doing with the painting. Now, if she described what was in the painting, she said, "And here there is meaning and truth." That would be incredible, but it's impossible. The thing with a modernist writer is it's the act of striving for meaning that's far more important than actually sort of getting there. So, in the same way that Kafka points to a transcendence which will never reveal itself, I think Woolf is doing that with the painting. Lukács is a fascinating reader of modernism, I think. The thing about Lukács, he himself, as a young man, was immersed in that kind of sort of decadent German culture, which he turns against when he discovers Marxism. But what's interesting is that it actually makes him a very interesting reader of modernism, because by and large his description of what's going on with modernism, like his description of sort of religious atheism, a sense of sort of God-forsakenness, so if for an Enlightenment thinker, the absence of God or some sort of external authority was seen as a liberation, for a modernist writer, it wasn't seen as a liberation at all. It was seen as a sort of a prison, and he used the word God-forsakenness. So he calls them religious atheists, and I think that's a particularly sort of resonant description of them. The problem with Lukács is he just says they're wrong. They shouldn't be writing like this, and I would say they're not choosing simply to abdicate their position in the world as realist writers. It feels necessary. There is in some ways objectively a crisis of meaning for the type of writers that they were, and the type of sort of milieu in which they're involved in. So Lukács is a fantastic sort of reader, in some ways sort of critic of modernism, but his proposals and his solutions are useless. It might, in some ways it's just often kind of socialist realist, boy meets tractor romances. It's not particularly artistically pleasing.
Yeah, so just in front of where we were before.
Well, I wanted to say something about Mann's, Death in Venice, which I have to say made me cry, and not many things can say they did that. And I think that what happens there is, through the character of Gregor, with the funny last name, he represents what you said was happening in reality. And there's also the references to the various, to the physical locations. So he starts off being this, kind of altogether tough guy, man of reason, who's very successful as an artist, and he's in Europe. And both physically, in terms of him moving to the exotic southern part of Europe, interestingly to a man-made southern part of Europe, because he goes to Venice, but then there's all these allusions to the exotic India, etc. The more he becomes in touch with his inner self and his passion, the more he degenerates. So he degenerates physically, and he seems to degenerate artistically as well, because he kind of gives up his art. And his only way out at the end is, you know, there is some kind of transcendence as he goes into the light, and then you realise he just died. So I think that, you know, what Mann does through that character is that he expresses the, you know, the fear of, whilst these artists are looking to the inner self, there's actually a fear of going too deep, because there is this dark inner passion of man that they're afraid of. And I think that's expressed in Kafka as well, where, you know, the inner self in Kafka is actually, you know, vermin. And the only escape for, you know, the guy whose name I can't remember, the Beatle, he actually dies. So, you know, he has no transcendence. But I still think that the interesting thing in Kafka is that even when the beetle is at his most base, there's still an element of humanity when he says, how can I have lost all my humanity if I can appreciate the violin? You know, when his sister's, you know, playing, you know, the violin. So, yeah, so I suppose that's the point that I'm making, is that I think that what Thomas Mann is trying to do through his character is reflect what's going on, but also to give voice to the fact that people are actually afraid of this you know, this self-examination. They're afraid of what's inside man, and whilst they want to go inside and explore man, they're actually afraid of what might be there.
Thanks. So we're Claire, and then Justin, can you bring it down in front here, there with just back top.
I think that your explanation into the lighthouses was really important in terms of that kind of central part of time passes and what's happened before. But one of the things that's interesting is that it does seem to me that because Mrs. Ramsey acts as the creative consciousness and then she's gone, that actually the irony is there is nostalgia for meaning as expressed in the novel. In many ways it reflects what's happening, you see what I mean? So without her, everyone's disorientated, and she was the kind of light, but that in some, the irony then is that it's almost like she does long for, or there is an expression of longing for when there was meaning. So even though it's a rejection and a turning her back on the time of meaning, as in representative art and realism, ironically, there is something of the yearning for it and understanding that it did hold things together, even though it's expressed in this new form. So that's kind of interesting. The other thing is that we haven't mentioned, and I know it's not to be over schematic at all, because it's not like this, but it is nonetheless, and we're about to have the lecture later on, the time of Freud and psychology, which was reflected in it. And I do entirely appreciate that it's not sort of like, and everyone turns inwards because there's Freud, but it isn't a coincidence that at the same time of this turning inwards in literature, which I actually do agree with your explanation of why it is, but nonetheless there is also a body of human sciences that are beginning to say meaning is derived from what's going wrong with your consciousness and fractured consciousness and so on in terms of psychology. So I don't think it's just straightforwardly the kind of disillusion with 1848. There's also scientific moves. There's things are changing that make people think like there's more to it than what's on the surface, if you want. But one of the things Jane and I were actually talking over breakfast about, when you've read, when you kind of read, Portrait of an Artist, or when you read Timur Leighton, you actually become entirely self-conscious about your own consciousness for days after. You kind of wonder around going, oh yes, that's all. But the irony is that it does actually make real something as well. So for all of the no representation, it actually does represent consciousness. That's what's so ironic about it. And then finally, just on the mirrors question, I think that the mirrors question is very important. The broken mirror, I mean. It comes up throughout, and obviously man reflecting himself in the mirror is sort of constantly one of the ways that literature talks about, I mean historically now, not just in this period, historically about how literature is about us understanding our own nature. And I think that you mentioned Wilde, and obviously the picture of Dorian Gray is a kind of great discussion on how representative art no longer works, because here you have the perfect representation of man that to all intents and purposes is more human than the man, that then gets put in the attic and rots as the soul, and the real man isn't the real man, but the real man is in the rotting picture that's no longer representative art, if you know what I mean. I'm doing that too crudely, but one of the reasons I'm saying it is because one of the things that has happened in terms of the dissolution is this idea of of hypocrisy, basically, of the kind of a society that doesn't allow you to be yourself. And this is particularly true, you know, in kind of modern societies, hypocrisy, Victorian England, and all that sort of like what's lying underneath, right? What's really going on, that you're forced to give a certain appearance of things, but then actually, if you pull back the layers, you'll find out there's a beast or an equal person, and you can never trust what you see. So I think there are a number of other things that are being explored in this literature, and you know, the cry of "I am a man, not a beetle," look beyond what I appear to look like, I think is also part of the plea of not just seeing the representation of things as being the reality, but if you look behind, there's something else.
Okay, well, I just had this very, unintellectual approach to English literature. I just read what I enjoyed, and I kind of shared Jenny's point here, saying that when I read The Lighthouse, I also had this kind of feeling it was all so bleak, and I can understand your answer saying yes, they do have a right to write in that way. But my question is, how does somebody like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, for example, fit into that? Who's very, very different, not intellectual at all, but seems to me a very conscious counterposition to that kind of trend. Turning very consciously towards society. While these people hated the suburbs, for example, he has this part in his book praising the suburbs, talking about modern education, praising modernity, specifically writing for newspapers, which was something I believe was also hated by Virginia Woolf, because that was made for the masses. So there seem to be these kind of two different trends in English literature, and how does that fit together?
Sorry, Dave, do you want to come back?
Yeah, I'll come back. In relation to what Jean was saying about the Death in Venice, I think it does. It is almost a portrait of the fate of art in the age of its impossibility, the descent of the artist into decadence. It is spectacularly sort of atmospheric. So it's in Venice, and you can almost smell the rot from the pages. He's in a rotting, decaying place. And Aschenbach had previously been sort of characterised as someone who lived despite his various weaknesses. He would work incredibly hard despite feeble. And you get the feeling he's relinquishing that self-mastery, that self-control in the context of Venice. And with that, he's tending towards a newer model of art, which is something which might be advocated or talked about or alluded to in the work of Nietzsche. But what's interesting actually is the Freud element to Death in Venice. Because if art has sort of traditionally seen as the making sublime of something, the sublimation process of seeing something, of making something grand from a set of sort of resources. In the Death of Venice, you have his art being de-sublimated, so you get to see the muse. So if Freud might want, if a vulgar Freudian might want to argue that all art is just, an expression of sort of various sort of sexual psychopathologies, in Death in Venice you have that played out. So that Aschenbach's muse, you actually see his muse, you actually see the reason why he might want to continue making art in the age of its impossibility, which is, his sexual attraction to a young boy. So art is no longer great, it's no longer sublime, it's being de-sublimated by a kind of Freudian reading. The reason why I think particularly mention Freud is that I feel that Freud is a contemporary of these writers rather than someone they were particularly influenced by. I think that's my feeling. In some ways, Freud was as immersed in that particular sort of modernist culture. We've heard a lot about Nietzsche and so on. So I didn't think that Freud would shed light on those writers. That was all. So Arthur Conan Doyle. There is something bleak to a lot of modernist works, and there is an intense snobbery to the works, which in some ways is understandable. If modernism is born of a turn away from, as far as they can see, a sort of a Philistine, sort of barbaric world of people that are just interested in sort of trivial things and have no sort of familiarity with high culture. You can see why there would be snobbery in the kind of work that would eventually be generated. I think modernism in some ways is to be understood as a crisis of high culture as much as anything else. I think that the main protagonists, the main sort of modernist protagonists, are usually people who are immersed in a particular tradition of and incredibly erudite and familiar with the ancient Greeks and every sort of great moment in sort of the Western tradition, and that gives them that, on the one hand, the insight into the decay of tradition, into the sense that it's being undermined as far as they can see by sort of crude, barbarised society. Nietzsche, you see that same snobbery. He's terrified of the herd and the mob and the levelling down process he sees. So their perspective is from the perspective of high culture, so it does always have that sort of snobbish aspect. But there's actually an interesting book by Frank Kermode called History and Value, because he wants to suggest why is modernism sort of valued in literature departments across the country? Because there was other writing going on in the 20s and 30s which we just don't seem to hear about. And I can't remember exactly the type of writings he was talking about, but a lot of them seem to be sort of based in the Welsh valleys as far as I can tell. But there was other writing out there. There was other writing which continued a particular sort of critical realist tradition. And I suspect there might be some sort of political reasons why they still felt there was something worth representing in the lives of men and women in these particular communities. I don't know enough about it, so Arthur Conan Doyle. That's what I was.
Thank you. So we'll go with Dave and then.
No, this weekend I was reading a review of what is I think about 3 or 4 different Kafka biographies or books on Kafka that have come out in one go. But one of them relates the story of Kafka, how he was out in the park one day and he comes across a little girl who's crying, and he asks her why she's crying and discovers she's lost her doll. So what he insists on doing is taking down her name and address and then starts writing her letters from the perspective of the doll, coming up with this narrative of how she's met another doll and they've eloped together and then they have to set up home, and she eventually has to explain that the doll is going her separate ways and she needs to make peace with that loss but to look towards optimism. Which is a kind of reminder always of this, there's still a kind of playfulness to a lot of these kind of modernists. As much as you can hang on to the kind of extreme philosophical bleakness that there is, within Joyce there is this enormous, almost joyous celebration of the capacity and the hunger of the human mind for more. It's actually quite riveting reading, Portrait of the Artist. It can be very bleak and troubling in places, but it understands where that is coming from. It's been driven from the guilt of institutions, that Stephen is still ultimately being corrupted by the authorities around him. Yes, in Woolf there's a kind of nostalgia and politically very troubling, but we have to remind ourselves that elsewhere she wrote incredibly penetratingly about the way in which the position of women within society, the way in which the inner world was governed by the external forces placed upon women's status within society. So we can go sometimes a little bit too far, I think, in how much man is dethroned by modernism. I think it still doesn't actually go all of the way. And at the same time, we sort of see this obsession again with the body, which particularly in English literature has been largely missing for about 200 years since the kind of sort of bawdiness of the post-restoration theatre. Suddenly the kind of body suddenly starts to come in with this kind of enjoyable fascination with its kind of sort of sexual kind of mores and and the kind of filth, and we get Lawrence and sort of Chatterley. But what's still also striking about that is that more that there's a kind of the mind is still very separate from the body in the world of this. That's the kind of joke that everyone finds themselves stuck in. That's the kind of absurdity of Kafka's existence, that we are governed by these unknowable, unreliable bodies that let us down, but within ourselves we still remain the same, which I think does seem quite striking today in relation to the fact that we all actually are part of nature, that we are governed by our nature, governed by our bodies and biology. So there still seems to be hope and optimism within modernism. It hasn't successfully killed off man in the same way that Nietzsche saw that God hadn't been killed off.
Yeah, just thinking about the role of art and artists in Death in Venice, To the Lighthouse, and the picture of Dorian Gray. And one just quick question on that. I wonder why they all choose as a character somebody who art in the form of painting and a painter. And you might expect, given the nature of self-reflection, that they would choose as a character somebody who was a writer. And I wonder why they choose painting as the art form to discuss in these works of art. But as you made the point, you no real desire to see Lily Briscoe's painting, and for all of them, the painting, well, apart from Dorian Gray, where the painting degrades, the painting doesn't really happen. It's not the focus, and the beauty is in the physical characters in all three of those books. You constant references to Mrs. Ramsay's beauty. And it's Dorian Gray as the character who remains beautiful. And I wonder if this ties in then with what Dave's saying about separation between mind and body, that you've got this kind of physical kind of celebration of the body, the artist as a work of art themselves, whereas the mind and the point that Claire was making about the hypocrisy is kind of not revealed really in Dorian Gray's physical appearance.
Thanks. Jane and Justin, do you want to take it back up to
me? Well, just following from Dave's point, because where a modern novel that isn't, modernist novel I think that isn't bleak, is Joyce's oeuvre. And you think Portrait of an Artist, as a young man, is beautiful, and I don't think it is bleak. And you think the life-affirming sentence at the end of Ulysses, which is Molly Bloom's yesterday, it's the sentence that's known in literature as that affirmation of humanity. And is it that Joyce seems to be much more authentic in perhaps going the whole hog? So is that what, I think Virginia Woolf, I think her novels do seem to be more dishonest, I guess, because she is realising, as you say, Tim, quite consciously, the common reader, she says, I am going to very much set my stand against realism, so that there's almost a tension in all the time knowing, actually, I know realist novels, and I'm sort of not going to do it so consciously, whereas Joyce does seem to really just decide, I am going to examine my inner self and my inner soul. And also, I don't think you can say about Joyce, he is the elitist that Eliot or Woolf is. Again, it's very democratic. He takes Leopold Bloom, and he takes a Jew wandering around the streets of Dublin on the 16th of June. So it just seems that he doesn't seem to be in that elitist modernist framework, though ironically, obviously, in some ways, writing novels that are the most extreme, almost come to the end of that cycle and say it's too extreme now and we finish and need to break.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wondered if you could, because the title was sort of the inner nature, so I just wondered whether you could maybe prize apart the sort of the use of this as a device, a literary device, not just the modernist term that you're talking about. So, because it almost seems inevitable that it will happen. That you will, the novel will evolve in that way to become more concerned with the inner self. So I'm thinking, for example, of, I was really struck a few years ago reading The Secret Agent, and there's a scene in there where the husband and wife, it goes on for 2 or 3 pages, they're in the kitchen and they don't say anything to each other, they just completely don't, but they're thinking about their relationship and, and that's 20 years before To the Lighthouse. So I'm just thinking there just about it as a device. It obviously isn't, the book itself isn't about the inner self. It's not in the same genre that you're talking about. It's not the subject matter. But the novel is increasingly using this device. And I'm just wondering as well whether bringing it much further forward as well, Herzog, that kind of thing, And again, so just, yeah, like I say, the idea of it as a device rather than it being the core subject matter in the way that to the Lighthouse, say, the way you described. And then just a quick thing, I think you're right about the forgetting thing in Metamorphosis and Kafka, but the thing that struck me there was the forgetting and how easy it is to forget. It was the tenuousness that really kind of felt quite striking and, I don't know about depressing, but sort of stark shocking, I guess, is the thing about how easy it is to sort of, for things to just transform and become very dark very quickly, but just kind of forgetting who you were, forgetting the sun, let's move on. And I thought as you say, forgetting is a key theme, but the tenuousness, how easy it is for things to change quickly, is the really striking thing. It makes you wonder whether it feels like we don't really have a hold on anything, and things could change for the worse quite quickly.
Why always painting? I think because quite simply because it captures the representation of sort of dilemma or crisis most easily. What is a painter seeing that they're painting? So painting just serves to dramatise that crisis, I think most acutely. In the same way that music in modernism is the other end of the spectrum. In some ways, modernists would like to aspire to the status of music, which is seen as the non-representational art par excellence. Where form and content are sort of entirely, sort of almost at one. James Joyce is kind of sort of the Anglo-Irish modernism kind of joyfulness. Yes, I think that's probably true. My mea culpa is that I haven't read Ulysses, so I have to. I know it's a terrible thing to admit, but that's one reason why I steer clear of Joyce, because until I've read that, I don't feel in a position to talk about it. I can still sort of hear an intake of breath. Who here has read Finnegan's Wake? Bloody hell. Well done. Right. In a man in a nature, in a life technical device. You can see, you can trace the evolution of a focus on the interior life of certain characters. You mentioned Conrad. I think that a more important proponent would probably be Henry James, who would be a rough contemporary. Claire mentioned the fact that after reading sort of To the Lighthouse or Portrait of the Artist as a young man, she would walk around feeling incredibly introspective. I think after you read Henry James, conversations become incredibly sort of long and pause-ridden, and you can't. I find it absolute agony. You can trace the development of this kind of this focus on the interior life. But certainly within those fictions, they're still situated within sort of real settings, and plot is still sort of mobilising character development and so on. Only really with sort of full-blown modernism do you get that kind of break. In that Eric Auerbach reading, which I think on the reading list, the piece about to the Lighthouse. He makes the point. It's into the Lighthouse. You get this. It's at this point that the exterior life is entirely subordinate to sort of interior happenings, and I think that's the key switch. Because I think certainly in James and Conrad, that subordination is not in place. You still get to use the much a misunderstood word. You still get a dialectic sort of subject and object in Conrad and James. Actually, that's all I want to say.
Okay. So, what's down jacket again here and down Claire. So, wrapping up here.
Well, I have a question about the metamorphosis, and that is that after all these awful things happen, whatever your interpretation of them, it does seem that life for the family then takes on a new meaning, because they're all sponging off poor old Gregor, and living a life of idleness. And then after everything that happens, they all seem to get a job and seem to take responsibility for their own lives, which is quite, you know, you forget the whole thing that happened to Gregor, is quite an optimistic ending.
Thanks. Do you want to bring it to Claire?
I think I just want to say something about, maybe a little bit about literature more generally, because I enjoyed your Lukács on modernism point, Tim, because I think that, you know, there is a danger that, I mean, literature isn't a consolation, and in many ways it's not written for us to enjoy in a straightforward way. I mean, it's driven as an expression of what it means to be human, reflecting on what it means to be human at any given time, and, you know, kind of, if it's not to your taste, fine, but, you know, when we were reading last year, when we were discussing Sartre and Camus and so on, those novels aren't always an easy read, and they're not straightforward, and yet they probably represent the spirit of freedom in the modern age more than anything else. But they aren't, you don't read them kind of going, oh, what a romp, the great story or anything. I mean, that's not what they're, I don't mean that's not what they're there for, but what I mean is what they represent. And I think that there is, so I, just in terms of our expectations, and a little bit around the Conan Doyle point, I suppose, or even about people writing in the realist fashion from the valleys in the 1920s and 30s that you referred to. The point about this is that I think it's important to understand in relation to artists, they had no choice but to do this in a weird sort of way. Or art itself reflects that crisis in meaning. Everyone can carry on writing as a realist, but something had changed that is then reflected in art and literature. And although Virginia Woolf is conscious of it and says, I will now consciously try and express it, it's not a literary exercise, if you see what I mean. She's compelled to do that as an artist rather than just trying out an experiment. That's the sort of way that I think we should see it. The point then is that nothing can ever be the same again, because that literature has struggled. The history of literature is partially a struggle in form to express the inner voice, if you see what I mean. You know, it's kind of, it moves from very external storytelling, you know, so you kind of, you know, suddenly there's a soliloquy. Oh, in theatre we can have a soliloquy where you kind of talk to the audience, and that's a way of saying something that's not just reflected in overhearing a conversation. Because if you think about it, I know it sounds stupid, but if you think about it, we just take for granted, and we're now used to film and television and so on, that there are ways of representing what people think inside. But when people started writing, they didn't know how to do that, which is why I was a bit enthusiastic about Robinson Crusoe, which, by the way, Virginia Woolf was, because she made the point that this is the first attempt at doing this, and she actually is a great writer endlessly about Robinson Crusoe. But is that sort of attempt at trying to, you know, so he thinks, well, I'll have a journal, or I'll get him talking to himself, or I'll, you know, and all this. But you actually have to think, how will I get the person reading this to understand what's going on underneath the surface? And people try and find different ways. And so there's always been that attempt to do it. Then with realism, as Tim's brilliantly explained, plot goes, end of story. But you can now bring back plot. I mean, you know, post that period of realism, you bring it back, but you'll never forget, or no writer can possibly ever forget, that what is being found is a way of describing interiority, you see what I mean? And you no longer need to have a letter or a flashback, or, you know what I mean? Now everyone can play with this. And so, in that sense, regardless of bleak or not, they actually moved art forward in a revolutionary fashion, and artistic expression forward, in a way that it could never... So it doesn't matter whether they're elitists and hated the herd. It's neither here nor there. They've created works of art that mean that our understanding of ourselves through literature, which is accessible to everyone, including the herd, is now much more subtle and profound than it would have been if they hadn't written that way.
To the guy in the purple, we had him forward just in front of you.
No, I just wanted to, it's a question of interpretation really only, about the ending of Metamorphosis, which somebody mentioned finding it upbeat, and I have to be honest and say that I think it is one of the bleakest endings in all of literature. I really do. The parents admiring the daughter, in her new clothes or whatever on the tram, just the world going on in this complete indifference to Gregor's fate, which that's what's great about what we're talking about in a sense, and what Claire has just said about literature itself and its possibilities. It makes me think as well of the Wandering Rocks chapter in Ulysses. That kind of there's very much an awareness of the omniscient narrator who has been dispensed with arguably, but who has kind of come back, in the form of somebody who can kind of see, the different people at their, windows and going about their business in their daily life. I think obviously we haven't discussed there probably isn't really time to discuss what happened to literary modernism after Kafka and Woolf and Beckett and so on. But I was wondering if you or anybody has any thoughts about why there seems to be a crisis of modernism now, and how that can be not resolved, but why it has come to that pass. Is it because the peaks have already been reached, or is there something else that's that has to be discovered, so to speak?
The ending of the Metamorphosis. It's certainly happy for the family. I think that's fair to say. In some ways you can read the story as a story of a man who's no longer welcome in the family home. And it's given a kind of grotesque form. He is a beetle. So his death, understandably, they're very happy. But it's a sinister ending. I think it's not just the fact that the father just wants to, with the help of the maid, literally brush Gregor under the carpet. It's the fact that it ends with a portrait of the daughter. They just suggest, and they didn't, and throughout all this, they hadn't noticed that Gregor's sister had blossomed into a beautiful young woman, or some words to that effect. So you have this other metamorphosis going on, and you just wonder why the family are quite so happy with the fact that their daughter is at the stage where she can be married off. So that there's something really sort of uncomfortable and discomforting about that ending. What happened to literary modernism, and why is there a crisis of modernism today? Well, that's an easy question. No. What happened to literary modernism? Well, as Claire says, elements and aspects of it, stretch out and manifest themselves in plenty of sort of contemporary works. You can think of novels by Philip Roth, for instance, which are incredibly sort of self-conscious after a modern style, but they use that to their own ends. So there perhaps aren't those. You don't get too many high modernists in the manner of Beckett, but in some ways, where would you go after Beckett? This agonising attention to language and the purpose of artistic expression when there's nothing to express, and you're just trapped in a vortex with that moment. But what I will say is that those moments of kind of high modernism, unfortunately, they migrated into academia. They manifest themselves often in the agonised, sort of self-conscious writings of people we might want to associate with postmodernism. Be it someone like Jacques Derrida or Jean-Francois Lyotard. Such people constantly referenced modernist writers. In some ways, I think Derrida preferred Kafka and Beckett than he did to any sort of philosophy, Husserl or Heidegger. So that's kind of where high modernism kind of ended up. It kind of just became, petrified and ossified in the academy, and unfortunately often celebrated the things which modernists themselves thought were problems. Fragmentation would be celebrated by a postmodernist as a triumph of sort of particularism, as the promise of multiculturalism and difference and so on. The problems of objectivity of an omniscient narrator would be celebrated in the work of a postmodernist theorist as a triumph of sort of relativism, a recognition that there is no truth. So that's in some ways, that's my very brief answer, actually. And that is where I'm going to end it, much like Kafka ended his works with no particular end.